Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In today's episode, we're joined again by Lisa Taylor Austin. She's been a guest on this podcast before, and she's back because she has a number of questions on the topic that I've been thinking about, which has to do with healing narcissism. And I've started recording a series on this, and I was talking to Lisa, and we both got really excited. And some questions came up in her mind, so I invited her on. So without further ado, I want to bring on Lisa. Hello, Lisa. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me again, Dr. Mazzella. I think these questions are so important to explore because we see a lot on YouTube and social media about narcissism, but not much about treating it. So I think you're answering these questions is really helpful.
Yeah, that's great. I really appreciate you being here, and that's true. I feel the same way. There's a lot of descriptive material out there, but not as much on what does it actually look like, and how do we do this sort of thing? And for anybody who's either watching or listening, I just want to let you know that this is not just about a therapeutic process. This is even about how people can relate to one another in a relationship, because the tools or techniques that I use, I think most of them are easily transferable, if that makes sense.
Yes, that's a really good point. I think that possibly people can use some of this with their sisters, brothers, colleagues. We were talking before, Dr. Mazzella, and you've said that the core of narcissism is this grandiose self-structure, almost like a protective shell. I picture a turtle that holds the whole personality together. On one hand, it's delusional, but on the other hand, it seems necessary. So what does this grandiose structure actually look like?
It's such an important place to begin because what you're saying is true, and we have to think about this. If, in fact, it's the whole structure, the structure that holds the whole self together, again, when we're thinking about change, can a narcissist change, or how do you heal narcissism? The next question actually is then, how do we begin to work with this structure? And in order to work with it, we really need to understand what it is. So I'll just give a quick hello to this because I've discussed this in prior episodes. And I think this will sound familiar, Lisa, but it's not just about grandiosity, which is, I know sounds paradoxical because it's the grandiose sense of self. But what it entails is grandiosity, vulnerability, idealization, right? Devaluation, a limited capacity for empathy, a dismissive quality, meaning they don't really care deeply about others. So all of these things are actually part of the grandiose sense of self. And there's also a profound inability to depend on other people, right? Which undermines the foundation of true intimacy. So anyway, all of these are all different ways. That's what I'm describing, that narcissism, or grandiosity, I should say, presents itself. So I have an example of this too, but let me just pause there because I'm just curious what you think about me putting all of these together, the idealization, devaluation, all the things that I just mentioned.
You and I have talked about all of those things, I think, in the past. And what's interesting, I think, to people listening is that those are the qualities that they feel that someone with narcissistic personality disorder puts onto them as well.
Yeah,
so the narcissist is putting all these things on themselves, but also putting on the other people that they interact with. Am I
No, that's such a great point because that's part of the grandiose sense of self as well, believe it or not. This is what we call splitting. So oftentimes when things get split off, they're split, but they're also projected. So when they're projected, then they're put onto somebody else, the point that you're making. And this is all part of grandiosity too. And if they're not doing that, Lisa, sometimes you see this as well, which is they withdraw. So they may get angry or feel humiliated and they withdraw, not just from interpersonal relationships, but sometimes it's so severe that they withdraw from life. These are more like the vulnerable narcissists that we discussed in prior episodes, where they retreat even sometimes back to their bedroom and they have a hard time working or even getting out in the world.
Yeah. And that's difficult for the people in their lives to deal with, but I'm thinking it's also difficult for them to deal with.
Yeah. Look, I'll just give a really quick example of this just to drive it home, this grandiose sense of self, because you mentioned it's difficult for them to deal with. And that part is often overlooked because all is like the arrogance or like what people call the omnipotence or grandiosity. So picture the scenario if you can. Picture like a father who can't play with his child. And when you ask him, like, what's going on? He says, oh, kids are boring, or it's just a waste of time. And that seems so off-putting. But when you start getting closer to somebody like this and you try to explore what that means or what it looks like or what their experience is, they start to talk about how it's not productive, that he should be spending time, he begins to tell me, working on something big and great. In other words, something that he says will bring him world-renowned recognition. So
something more grandiose.
Yeah, see, that's the grandiosity, right? But you can't stop there because this example, I think, we can all see the grandiose sense of self, right? But it actually, with that little vignette that I just gave, includes all the other things that I just mentioned. Like here, let me just break it down quickly. You immediately, Lisa, heard the grandiosity, right? Doing something great. So that's part of it. What about the idealization? That's there too. But now it's an idealization of the self, right? Sometimes they idealize other people. Then there's devaluation. Where do we see devaluation? Of his child, who's not important enough for him to spend time with. And then there's a limited capacity for empathy, another thing we often talk about. But that limited capacity for empathy is because of the grandiosity, that he can't connect. He can't think, oh, my child may need a father to play with. And then finally, there's that dismissive quality that I mentioned. And again, that, which is he dismisses his child. So if his child wants to play, he becomes quite dismissive as if, that's not important. That's not important stuff. So you could see there, I don't know if that makes it a little bit clearer, but those are all the characteristics that actually make up the one characteristic that we unfortunately just focus on, which is the arrogance or the grandiosity.
I think that's a really good example that many people can relate to. And it very much points out that the person with narcissism is thinking that way internally inside themselves about themselves, but also displaying it and portraying it onto another person.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, I think there's more subtle forms of grandiosity. And I'm wondering, I don't know, do you have thoughts or examples of what they might be?
Yeah, so the main thing that I think that we could take away from the more subtle forms, because a lot of people have heard of the covert narcissist. I'm sure you've heard of this concept as well. Right.
Yes.
And I think even in an earlier episode, either you and me, Lisa, I'm not sure if we spoke about this, but I like to use Tony Soprano as an example, right? Where you often see the grandiosity, but not the more subtle vulnerability that they also have. But the main point that I wanted to make is that the vulnerability and all those other traits that I just mentioned that make up the grandiosity, that they coexist. In other words, they operate in a dynamic, shifting relationship. In other words, one is rising and the other one is like, you don't see it. That's the covert part. Like you may not see the vulnerability. You may not see the longing, right? You may not see the dependency needs, but they are still there. So if we just go back to this example I gave just for another moment with the father, right? On the surface, we see the grandiosity. We said that. His drive to achieve something monumental and for him to be recognized by the world. But underneath, what lies is a profound vulnerability. And that's what we begin to get into. This is part of working with somebody or relating to somebody. We try not to get caught up with the manifest presentation. And what we begin to talk about is that he has a deep fear of being present and playing with his child, or even just being playful, because being playful and connected may, one, expose him. What if he doesn't do a good job? See, so now he could be inadequate. But also what we came to see is that when he does it, this is quite ironic, he likes it. He likes playing with his child. And now he's exposed because that brings up a need in him to be connected. And anybody who knows somebody who has these narcissistic characteristics, this will sound very familiar, that it's very hard for them to feel connected and have a need. because, again, that dismissive quality, and that can't be tolerated. So anyway, the initial intervention, just to be very specific, so that we could begin to get into this other side of himself, is that I may say something like this to him or to somebody in this situation where they can't play or really be with another person. Like with him, I said, playing with your son feels like a waste of time. You see, now, that's very close to the surface. I'm not making any deep intervention. And then I could say to him, but it sounds like the time that you spent with him stirs up something uncomfortable, maybe even a feeling that's hard to put into words. So initially, I'm not labeling anything. That, Lisa?
Yes.
All I'm doing is describing that he is unable to put something into words. Like he feels uncomfortable playing, but he's not sure why, except that it takes him away from his world tour domination fantasy.
Yeah, it sounds like you're trying to get him to identify how he even feels as a starter.
Exactly.
Because a lot of times people with narcissism don't know how they feel.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And that's why I'll just say very quickly, there's so much on social media and people have good insights, but I think what goes unrecognized is that when you tell somebody something like how they're feeling, usually, at least in my experience, with somebody who has these narcissistic disturbances, that doesn't go over very well because then they typically push back on it. It's far more unless they're really close to it. In other words, like they're just at the precipice where they're about to recognize a feeling. But otherwise, if you're telling them how they feel, the whole structure is designed not to feel. So that it's going to be hard for them to accept something like that. And then that's just going to lead you to get further frustrated, by the way, because then you're going to say, you never listened to me.
I think that also might activate like their fight or flight mechanism too, where we don't want to talk about feelings. We don't like feelings. So now I'm going to want to either argue with you to push you away, or I'm going to want to find an out and flee the situation.
Yep, exactly. Or retreat back and get back into the grandiosity. What a stupid thing for you to say. That doesn't make any sense. What's the matter with you?
Yeah. And sometimes they go back into that turtle shell that we were talking about earlier. I was listening to you talking about covert narcissism, and I have found that sometimes their grandiosity is very subtle and covert, obviously, where they might be the helpful person. They're helping you and they're legitimately helping you.
Yeah.
This is a misnomer on social media too, that narcissists or people with NPD don't help people. They do for a number of different reasons. But anyway, they'll be helping you, but then maybe later their grandiosity comes out. They might not say it exactly like this, but they might say something that indicates only they could help you.
Yep.
They were the only one who could do what you needed.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, exactly. Like I alone, like only me. And that leaves the other person feeling what? Like they really need you then, which is a great feeling because now that also helps with the grandiosity and never feeling alone because this person really needs me. Not only am I convinced of it, but they're convinced of it too because I'm the only one who could really understand them and relate to them in this way.
You know, they say teaching is the mother of all professions, but right now it feels like it's happening inside a pressure cooker. That's why we created Higher Listenings, bringing a dose of joy to the future of learning. We're exploring things like why reading may not be obsolete after all, the remarkable connection between emotion and learning, and the real reason students cheat.
It's not a moral failing. It's the circumstances that they find themselves in.
Join us on Higher Listenings, because those who can make a difference teach.
And that goes back into when we're talking about especially coverts, that shared fantasy. They need me, I need them, and then that starts to develop even more.
Yes. Yep. Exactly.
So what does it look like for you to actually help someone who has this grandiose sense of self? Like, how do you work with it in practice with your patients? Maybe you have an example that you could give us.
Yeah. So here's another example, another way that this may present itself, and I think a lot of people could relate to.
Okay.
So we spoke about the father not being able to play. A lot of people could probably relate to being with someone who has an incapacity for playfulness, like they're very driven. So a lot of people are also with someone who maybe gets angry, right? If you make a request of them or you give them some kind of feedback, they blow up maybe in a fit of rage. So in this example, again, a hypothetical patient who comes in, like a prototypical patient, he gets a request at work, right? Someone calls and asks him to do something at work, which, by the way, is his job to be doing this at work. But he slams the phone down. He goes into a fit of rage, right? Now, the phone call requested that he do something. And on the surface, it might seem like an overreaction, like slamming the phone, cursing. But what's happening internally is far more complex. And as Lisa, this is what we need to get to. Like what's going on inside of him. Just like we don't want to get caught up in the grandiose presentation, we don't want to get caught up in the angry presentation as well. At that moment, I could see it more like a smokescreen. He begins to talk to me. If the first order of business in terms of interventions and how I work with them, and I'm not going to go over this in detail because you and I covered this already, Lisa, and I would encourage anybody who's like watching or listening to go back and listen to any of the content on containment, right? Containment is just helping somebody get into a more regulated state. And that always has to be the initial intervention when somebody comes in so hot and angry like this. So what he ends up doing, once the act of containment, and I can help him turn an affect storm into just like a mild storm, right? So he begins to think, and he starts to think about what it was like growing up. And he spoke about how he was someone who was capable when he was younger and was quite intelligent, but he felt like he never got the support that he needed. Now, this is really important because oftentimes patients or your partners may reflect back to childhood experiences and use it defensively. And what I mean by that is they don't use it to really understand something, but they could use it to blame a parent, for instance, why you are a certain way. So anytime a patient of mine goes back and starts reflecting on history, it's really important to help them connect the affect, that it's affectively alive. So with this fellow, as he goes back, and what we begin to discover is he was very intelligent, but then when the work in school became more demanding and required more of him, because he didn't have what he felt was the emotional support that he needed, that he was not able to perform. And this is like a litmus test. I sometimes sort of half joke about this, but in doing an assessment, I always wonder when someone excels academically or excels at work, I can ask them, how did you do in calculus? Or how did you do when it came to physics? And oftentimes that's where you see the first cracks with people who do have narcissistic traits. Why? Because some of them are naturally intelligent and they could get so far without working and putting in effort and delaying gratification. This is what he and I begin to talk about. And he said that he never felt like his parents saw him and he never felt supported by them. So slowly we begin to see that when he's at work years later and the phone rings and it's a request, it's a small one, but it demands the same kind of effort. Then suddenly from childhood, believe it or not, yes, this stuff doesn't go away. Hopelessness, yeah, you know this, Lisa, it starts to come over. So what we discover is the feeling isn't, I'll try, right? It's, I won't. I'm not doing this. But just beneath the surface, it's that I can't, and I'm all alone, and nobody's here to support me. And this is what we call psychic helplessness in my field, and that's too painful to endure. It's much more comfortable attacking somebody else or getting angry. At least then you feel in control. So beneath the protective shield now of this angry affective storm is a deeper, more painful feeling that we slowly come to discover of, I'm all alone with no support. So that's just a sort of descriptive presentation, but it does speak to in a way, Lisa, how I work with this, because one thing I said is the act of containment. The second thing is, from a psychodynamic perspective, not just buying into what I called the smoke screen a little bit earlier, the rage, but containing that and trying to understand in a more reflective way what's going on beneath the rage. So let me just pause there. Yeah, please jump in.
That was a really good, clearly articulated example.
Right.
And I think what happens is when the narcissist is slamming the phone down, there's really fear there too.
Yes.
A fear I'm not going to do it right, a fear that I'll be judged, a fear that I'll be abandoned in some kind of a way.
Yes. Yep, absolutely. And during this initial pass, like if we follow this and we think of it like a process of change, that's good to keep in mind, Lisa. But to go back to what we said a moment ago, you don't want to label it just yet, unless he's close enough to it. If you could feel it in yourself, or, that he's using words that suggest that it's close enough to awareness, then absolutely you could begin to make that, you can use that kind of intervention and reflect back, how he seems to be angry, but you're also wondering, is there something that is scaring him about doing this project? That's a reasonable way to go. So in terms of psychodynamic techniques, so one thing that we want to accomplish is, of course, self-reflection, which is what I'm mentioning. And
Yes.
The other thing is integration. And you may have heard me speak of this before, but if the underlying premise is that in a personality disorder, there's a fragmented sense of self, this is the splitting, by the way, that we spoke about just a little bit earlier, which is a problem, of course, because when things get split off, they get projected. And then when they're projected, they're put on somebody else. And that's a whole different story. Again, this is just a plug for something that Lisa and I already spoke about, which is called the projective introjective malignant cycle. So we don't need to go over that again. But the goal then is integration. And this means helping the person become aware of and bring together these highly contradictory and often distorted internal representations. Now, what does that mean? I'll just say very quickly, it means the internal representations are the idealized. So now we're back to that, which I said is a part of the grandiosity. And that comes out with this little example of, I'm above this, or I'm not going to do this stupid project, or why can't, X, a colleague of his, do the project, as if he's above it. There's the idealization, the idealized sense of self. And then, of course, the devalued, right? You want to bring these two together. What's the devalued? That's the images of himself of what? I'm all alone, or I'm afraid, to your point, Lisa, or that I can't do this, or that I don't have support, that I'm not capable, basically. That's a devalue. So when they're splitting, these two are very far away, and you only see one, the grandiosity, or the other, like with the more vulnerable narcissist, the I can't do this. So that's the second major goal of a psychodynamic approach, is slowly helping them bring these two together in a more integrated way, if that makes sense. And I could, of course, keep going, Lisa, but please feel free.
Yeah. You want to merge these different aspects of them together, because the patient client themselves probably isn't even aware that they have these split things going on inside of themselves. So how do you even begin to do that in therapy?
Yeah, so let me just say, you are right. They don't even know. They're not aware that they have it. And that's, I don't want to say the beauty of splitting. That's one of the ways it works. Is
It works.
Really, sequester a whole side of yourself so that you're not even aware of it. But for anybody who's watching Severance, which is a TV show that came out recently, the whole premise of the show is based on splitting. And I won't go into the show in any detail, but the main point that they made quite nicely is that even when things get split off, they tend to make their way back into consciousness. So you can never really get rid of this stuff. Even though you're projecting, it still doesn't get rid of it. So anyway, that was a little bit of a digression. Sometimes when I watch TV, I love to analyze these things and the meaning of it, like from a psychodynamic perspective.
How do you even begin to start to do this in therapy? Like, you have to form a therapeutic alliance first, I would think. Can you talk to us about how you go about doing that with someone with NPD, and then how you start to get these different facets of themselves to integrate? I'm sure that's a process. It's not a 1 or 2 session conclusion.
Yeah, because one thing is that they have to begin to develop what we call trust, like analytic trust, which means that there's a trusting person in the room, which implies there's another person in the room with them that they can hear. And that in itself is a process with anybody who has narcissistic characteristics. Oftentimes, there are not even two people in the room. It's all about them. I think all of you know that who are listening and watching.
Yes.
That's the first step, is building a trusting relationship where two people exist. But to do that, and I know, again, I promise I'm not going to go over this again, but that's the act of containment. That's in other words, we don't make these kinds of interventions early on because someone will just get very upset. They'll think that you're crazy, like this guy, this example that I just gave. If I came right out and told him that you're angry because you're defending against being all alone in this project and feeling like you're not capable, he'd say, what are you, crazy? That has nothing to do. I'm angry because they gave me all this work to do. It's so far from their level of awareness, and that's the whole way the structure is set up. So it's set up perfectly to keep the more painful feelings away, but that does not mean we could just introduce them back in, because that would be very upsetting to them. So the first step is building this trust, and the way to build the trust is through the act of containment, demonstrating curiosity, interest, never judging. Like, you see, nothing to do. I'm not upset that he's angry and smashing his phone. I'm not judging him for that. I'm curious, and by being curious, I'm showing him I can tolerate this. It's not something to be embarrassed of. These are things we could talk about. So all of that is part of the process in terms of helping them not just become more self-reflective, not just to be able to reflect on their inner world, but to begin to trust me as well, so that when we get to these higher level interventions, which are going to be necessary to begin to heal NPD, they could trust, so that when I do have a different opinion, or I do make a leap, like you mentioned like a moment ago, Lisa, about fear. Remember I said if they're close enough to it, but they also have to trust you. Trust something that's coming from you, so they don't just push it away. So all of these are, not that I'm trying to be overly schematic, but there are steps that need to be taken. It's hard to just say, I'm going to do this when this preliminary work has not yet, like, you need to build the foundation for someone to be able to hear you and have them be curious about what's going on, not only in their mind, but also in your mind as well, and to be able to work with you on that.
Yes, and that takes time. So in the therapeutic sessions, how is it different working with someone with NPD versus someone who maybe has a different diagnosis?
Oh, that's so interesting. That's a good question.
I know it's probably a complex one.
Yeah, but let me stay consistent with the answer, okay, since we're here already. So one of the big differentiating factors with a personality disordered versus a non-personality disordered patient or partner, let's say, because again, we're thinking about everybody who's listening or watching, is when, let's just use an example of you're working on, like this, with this fellow who comes in and he's angry, right? Do you have a feeling that you're trying to work on something together? In other words, are you trying together to figure out his anger? That's one of the big differences. So somebody with a personality disorder will come in with the expectation that you will solve this problem magically for them and quickly as well. You will give them the answers, even though they can't hear the answers. We just said that a moment ago. That's irrelevant. They still want the answers. They don't want to think. Okay?
Can I pause you right there?
Yeah.
That is interesting to me, because if they have this grandiosity, how is it that they think another person could help them? They should be able to know to help themselves.
Yeah, that's right. That's right, Lisa. And it's such a paradox, right? Because beyond the grandiosity, remember what makes up part of the grandiosity is the vulnerability.
Yes.
And even though they don't want to depend on anybody, guess why they don't want to depend on anybody? Because they have such dependency longings. They need somebody. But
Fear.
you'll never hear that. You'll never hear that they have a longing to be close, because you just always see the opposite. So they're there. So they do want the answers from you, right? But in a more magical way, where they feel very much taken care of. There's the childhood stuff that we're not even getting into today. But something that went missing in early childhood is that really strong connection, the affect attunement, someone being emotionally responsive to them, empathy, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, to answer your question, yes, it is a paradox that they are looking for something, even though they think they have the answers, they do want something from you. But then once you give it to them, because it threatens now the grandiose sense of self, right? And it gets pushed away. And that's why oftentimes things don't change with these patients, because they're rejecting. And there's the other big difference right there. So working with someone who's personality disordered versus not, someone who's not, there's more of a collaborative effort. We call this a therapeutic alliance, two people working together on a project instead of just save me or rescue me or take care of me. And then when there is an insight, when you do share something with them, they internalize it. They're able to take it in and think about it. Where somebody with a personality disorder, as we just mentioned a moment ago, may feel envious, like that you have something that they don't have, and then therefore it needs to get rejected and pushed away. And these are all the things you need to be alert to, because they may not overtly reject you. Some do, by the way, and they say, that's the stupidest interpretation I've ever heard. I'm better off watching Oprah. She's more intelligent than you. But some of them don't do that, but what is over time, nothing changes. And that's an indication that they're not really taking in and thinking about the work that's being done in the sessions.
Very good.
That, Lisa, leads into a whole nother set of interventions that I want to talk about with you, which I don't give them levels, but like these are like level 2, like more advanced level interventions. And I don't even want to call them interventions, because we're also thinking about people who have these partners in their lives. But let's say more advanced, or let's say different ways to talk to people when you don't feel like you're really making a connection. But maybe we could save that because we have something upcoming. Is that right?
Yes, I think that over on my channel, we're going to continue this discussion.
Yeah.
So people could follow over there if they're interested in hearing the rest of this.
Yeah, that's great. And we want to keep this going. I want to give more examples and be more, like even more specific, like what we're doing right now, Lisa, but we're going to use a couple of other examples to show. So this way, everybody has a bunch different techniques or tools at their fingertips and ways that you can engage somebody like this in your life. Lisa, I want to extend a big thank you again for coming up with such thoughtful questions. You really give this a lot of thought and consideration, and I appreciate it. So I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation. So for the listeners, stay tuned. As always, I'll put the link below to Lisa's site. If you want to continue to listen to this discussion, it will be below. Lisa, thank you again. Yes.
Thanks so much.
Okay, everybody. Bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.